A change of tack for our next guest, or next speaker and guest. Last year I was working at UTAS and picked up a paper called, it had the headline, Boring Billion. And I thought, well, there's nothing better than a boring billion. It's something you have to read. Indrani Mukherjee is the lead author. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Uni of Tasmania. She did her bachelor and her master's degree in degrees in geology at the University of Delhi, and she completed her PhD at UTAS just last year. Now, her research focuses on how the geochemistry of the Earth has changed throughout deep time and how that affects the evolution of life on Earth, and that is life as we know it now. So, as I mentioned last year, she and her team published a cracking paper in Nature. It was called The Boring Billion, a Slingshot for Complex Life on Earth. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Indrani Mukherjee to the stage.
Can everybody hear me? I am known to be very loud, so hopefully. Thank you all for coming and for my talk. I hope you've all stocked up your glasses with whatever beverage you're on, because what you are about to hear is quite unbelievable. Disclaimer, I thought I'll read it out for the lazy bees. The views expressed in this presentation are not meant to offend any party. They've been collected from various platforms and we don't have any rights over the copy. These are meant for entertainment purpose only, and that's my plan tonight, to entertain you all and convey some message, the research that I'm really passionate about. I would like you all to meet my team. They not only contribute to my research, but they are very supportive of what I do as well. And we are called the TEPO team, and I'm pretty sure you don't want to know why we are called the TEPO team. I mean, it's quite a ridiculous name in my opinion, because I would much rather be something like this. I mean, here I have Captain Picard. I hope we've got some Star Trek people out here. I mean, if not, then what a waste of a slide. But really, it's space and the final frontier. I mean, we would love to call ourselves Deep Time and the final frontier, going where no one has ever gone. And as some of you may note, I put myself as William Riker, the number one for the officer. A lot of my colleagues were like, how do you get to be a William Riker? You're a woman. And I'm like, well, I am the speaker, so I get to choose what I want to be. Evolution of life on Earth. So if we were to simplify evolution of life on Earth against the geological time scale, say, for example, 4 billion years to present day, this is what it would look like. So we started out being very simple cell organisms to a complex cell, and then we grew in size, macroscopic, such as the dinosaurs, and things got more and more complex. And then we had this. I mean, who would represent complexity more than Freddie Mercury? I reckon he's a benchmark of complexity, in a human sense, of course. Jokes apart, if you were really to understand how life evolved on Earth, first originate and then evolve from being very single cell to complex and large. So all that stuff I showed you in the previous slide, you can cram it all up in the last 1,000 million years. And life prior to that was very microscopic, tiny, but very significant. And that's the area that I like to focus on, the micro world. And it's an incredibly extraordinary world. It gives us a lot of clue. So that was the point I was trying to make. We did evolve as we did, and all the macroscopic organisms are all crammed in the last 1,000 million years. And as always, as today, the micro world has colonized the surface of the Earth than any other species. Middle Earth. Now you must think, well, boring billion. What's the boring billion got to do with all of this? So there's a time span in Earth's history, as I showed you in the previous slide, from 1,800 million years to 800 million years, disparagingly known as the boring billion. I completely disagree with it. I'd much rather call it the Middle Earth. And a lot of you might go, Middle Earth? Yeah, I've heard that. where did I hear that? In Lord of the Rings? So I just want to clarify here. The Middle Earth, in reality, looked nothing like this. There were no lush green vegetation or clear blue oxic waters or creatures like Gollum or anything like that. This is probably a more realistic scenario of what the Middle Earth might have actually looked like, with very toxic gases being infused or introduced into the atmosphere through volcanoes, very anoxic waters, meaning oxygen-depleted oceans, nothing like today, and life was very single-cell. What you can see here are stromatolites. I'll point them out to you if the pointer works, but it's not. So it's these things here that are stromatolites, and you can still see them today in Shark Bay in Western Australia. So this is what the Middle Earth actually looked like. And if there was a Gandalf, if hypothetically, then that's what he would have said for the boring billion. Life was nothing but slime on Earth. And there is a Gandalf in the audience here, and I know him personally. And he published a paper, and he said life on Earth was nothing but slime for a boring billion years. Later on, I will introduce that or reveal who that Gandalf is. But that's what we think. And it's quite normal. As humans, we tend to relate ourselves with something we're more familiar with. So whenever we see a macroscopic fossil in the rock record, we make a hoo-ha about it. Oh, yes, evolution. But the micro world tends to sort of get brushed aside. And it's really the areas where we least look interesting is where we find life's most important questions and answers to it, such as slime. That's what we tried to do. As I mentioned to you before, this microbial world is absolutely extraordinary. I was at a conference in Boston, and we were taken to the Harvard Museum. And you can see in the picture there where we see microbial life, the whole blue circle there is the microbial diversity. Compared to animal and plant, it's just that single dot in there. So that's how diverse the microbial world is. And we can gain a lot of information that will give us a lot of idea about how life evolved on the planet. So what are some of the important clues that the microbes have already given us? Prokaryote to eukaryote transition. Yes, that's a bunch of jargon there for you, so I'll simplify it. A simple cell, the transition of a simple cell into a very complex one. Why is it relevant to you? You are made of it. You are made of approximately 34 trillion complex cells. That transition, the first complex cell, appeared at some point in Earth's history, and it was the boring billion time span. I don't see anything boring about it. Multicellularity. You and I are multicelled organisms. Some have more cells than the others, but we are multicelled organisms. And that's an example of that. That also evolved during the Middle Earth period. Origin of sex. Now, you've got to be grateful for that. I mean, the microbes were the trendsetters. They got the ball rolling. Yes, it was happening billions of years ago as well. Here I show you amoeba, pretty much caught in the act. So yeah, you would think, my goodness, what does that even look like? That's a schematic representation of a very complex cell. I know you're thinking, well, I remember waking up looking like that, or waking up next to someone who looked like that. But it's quite a significant thing, this eukaryotic cell. And you can see there's a big boundary. I'm sorry I can't use the pointer because it isn't working. But you can see a larger area, but within that there are components. So these cell components were incorporated within the larger cell in some order to form that first complex cell that you and I are made of. And biologists are working day and night to answer that question: when were these cell components incorporated and in what order? So it's quite an important question that scientists are trying to answer. How were these cell components incorporated within the larger cell to form the complex cell? Was it endosymbiosis? And yet again, I use a jargon, so I'm going to quickly step to the next slide. which is explaining the endosymbiosis theory, where two parties mutually benefit from one another. I'll give you a beautiful example. You know how we vote for politicians, and then they live up to our expectations, don't they? It's quite a symbiotic relationship. So yeah, two cells, individual cells hanging around and being incorporated with the larger cells saying, well, can you do something for me? I'll do something for you. An example of, oh, it's not working, that's fine. So this is an example of modern day endosymbiosis where the larger cell is a paramecium, and within it you can see clusters of green zoochlorella that are able to photosynthesize for the larger cells, so producing food and energy, and the larger cell is providing a safe environment for the little cell. So that could have been happening, and that could have been a process for the cellular components to first get into the larger cell. Yeah, a scenario is something like this, where they're like, well, we've been seeing each other, do you want to move in? So happy, yeah? We both benefit from one another. Or was it predation? You know, an amoeba, as a modern-day example, sucking the innards out of green algae. I'm actually kidding. This is actually a satellite image of Clive Palmer feeding on the barrier reef. Sorry. I hope I don't offend anyone. I did put the disclaimer in the beginning, so sorry about that. Or was it predation? But this is a modern-day example. You'd be like, well, was it occurring in the past? Well, of course, yes. And in Australia, these are samples from northern Australia, 1,400 million years ago, and researchers have worked on it, and they are quite confidently able to say that predation or predatory behavior was very common in the microscopic eukaryotes back in time. So was it predation why cellular components were ingested by the larger organism? We don't know. Now you'd think, well, she's gone on and on about this biology. She's a geologist, isn't she? What is she doing? And I know according to the very sophisticated Big Bang Theory, and I am talking about the TV show, yes, geologists are considered to be the Kardashians. We're not meant to be real scientists. We're not real celebrities. Well, we do our fair bit, I have to say. And the question we try and answer is why? What are the geological, more importantly, geochemical, geophysical factors that contribute to shape the course of evolution that we see today? What effect did that have on evolution of life on Earth? So it is pretty important, in my opinion. Was it oxygen? You and I are very dependent on oxygen today. Was it? And a lot of researchers believe that oxygen was a prime driver of evolution on Earth. But then you've got research that demonstrate that not all organisms require that much oxygen. In fact, modern analogues of primitive organisms actually require very little oxygen. So perhaps we should be focusing on other elements as well. Well, what other elements are essential for life? This, as you will remember, is the periodic table. And if you don't like or are not interested in what I'm listening to, you can look at this table and tell me which alphabet is missing. Right now, I'll focus on what elements are essential for life. Here in blue, I highlight some of the major elements present in higher quantities, and in red, the elements that are present in trace or minute quantities, and they are called trace elements. And we particularly like to focus on the trace element. Why? Because they are extremely important at basic cellular levels for metabolic pathways, enzymes, protein molecules, you name it. You need these trace elements to form these important chemical compounds for sustenance of life. So they're absolutely important. And not to forget that even Superman requires these trace elements. So they are pretty important. What do we do? By the way, that's pyrite disease over there, and I just have to announce I have got it. And I contracted that from my supervisor, who is, by the way, Gandalf, and this is the point where I'm meant to reveal his identity. I got the disease from Professor Ross Large. Please feel free to ask him where he got it from, but we are really obsessed with this mineral. We would like to extract as much information as possible from this mineral, just most abundant sulfide on the surface of the Earth as well, and try and understand a lot of these things. So how do we understand trace elements from pyrite is what I'm about to explain. So when you have a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, that facilitates a lot of weathering and erosion of nutrient elements on land. That then is transferred into the ocean via the rivers. So more oxygen, more erosion and weathering, more transport of the nutrients into the ocean. Once that makes its way into the ocean, they are then taken up by, or they are made available to the microorganisms in the water. Once they take that up, live their life, do whatever they like, and then they die. We all have to die at one point. So when they die and become part of the mud, even today at the bottom of the ocean where you're depositing sediments, these organisms die and form part of the mud and release those trace elements. Lucky for me, those trace elements then get absorbed into the mineral pyrite that's forming within these muds. So by looking at the trace element concentration of pyrite in these muds, we have a pretty good idea of what some of the bioessential trace availability might have been like in the past. So we look at pyrites from varying times, and we are able to construct nutrient availability trends. So this is what my rock looks like out in the field where we collect our rocks, and it's not to be confused with coal. It's a very sensitive issue, I know, and that is not coal. That is just simply black shale, and that's where we get our rocks from. And that's a close-up of the rock here. That's what it looks like in hand sample when I go and collect my rocks. Look for the pyrite in the rock. There I am cutting it so that I can prepare these mounts. Now these mounts are very important for us to then analyze for these various trace elements that we talk about. What do we see under the microscope? Before we try and understand any of this, we have to look at our rocks under the microscope a lot. And just like the biologists, we also do spend considerable time looking at our rocks under the microscope. The only difference being we don't intrude into the microorganism privacy as much as the biologists do. So this is what we see. There you can see my pyrites against the black background, and that's the sort of material that we analyze. And you'd be thinking, well, what do you actually do with it? Well, that's what we do. Isn't that amazing? We just shoot laser on it, and we just analyze it. I know a lot of the Star Trek nerds out there are probably going, well, that's not a laser, that's a phaser. Well, it'll have to do for now. It'll just simply have to do. That's the machine over there. It's a beast of a machine, and it allows us to measure the trace element concentration in the pyrite and give us what is that we need. Before I show you my results, I'd just like to show you this slide. Don't be bothered by all it's quite busy there. I just want you to focus on this red dotted box, because that represents the boring billion. And note how flat these lines are for these various bioessential trace elements. So previously people thought, well, there were no fluctuation in trace element availability or nutrient availability. It was all flat, no wonder life was very microscopic and boring. But that's not what I find in my rocks with my analysis. I see a change. Again, this is complex, so I'm going to simplify it. Please, again, concentrate in the box that represents the boring billion period. And on my y-axis, I have nutrient availability, and on my x-axis, I have time. So in the early part of the boring billion, there was a decline of trace elements. And somewhere around 1400, there was an increase of trace elements. So first, what we note, or what I noted, was that it wasn't flat as previously proposed. It was definitely showing some fluctuation. Now, this low period seems to coincide with all these biological innovations, forming of the first eukaryote, origins of multicellularity and sex, and the high nutrient period was coinciding with diversification. Now, why would that be? So what we came up with was stress in the form of nutrient scarcity might have prompted organisms to look for alternative mechanisms to survive. So it was probably stress that might have initiated endosymbiosis or predation, because we know that's how the first complex cell, two cells, came together. But why that process might have occurred is what we're trying to answer, and we think it might have been stress that may have prompted a larger cell to either happy endosymbiosis or not so happy predation. But either way, nutrient scarcity might have prompted organisms, sort of like an evolutionary pressure. So I blabbered on about it. Really what I mean is no pain, no gain. So glass half empty is not that bad. If your glass is totally empty, you're probably on the verge of extinction. But if it's half full, you're probably okay. And someone very wise said, miserable and dissatisfied is a good thing. Nobody ever accomplished anything when they were happy. So stress is actually good. Please embrace it, and thank you.
Indrani Mukherjee, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That was marvellous. And we started late and you're right on time. So I'm going to entertain at least one question. Ladies and gentlemen, the word of the day has got to be pyrite, or maybe eukaryote. We've got a question over here.
Your green slime, did it exist only in the oceans or also on land?
Good question. I don't see why it wouldn't exist on land and in ocean.
Supplementary.
It could be both.
So a large chunk of that time was before oxygen was plentiful in the atmosphere.
Sorry, could you please repeat that?
For a large chunk of that time, the oxygen level was less than it is now, more methane in the atmosphere. How did that affect your green slime up on land?
Well, it depends on what time you're talking. So if you are to look at the Proterozoic, this is a lot of jargon again. So between 3,500 to 2,500 million years ago, yes, there was a lot of methane in the atmosphere, and probably some dissolved as well. But we don't know. So slime didn't evolve until the Proterozoic, which is after 2,500 million years. And we didn't have methane-rich atmosphere then. We have very good evidence of increased oxygenation. In fact, the first oxygenation event was around 2.33 billion years ago, and it was quite a big event. We call it the Great Oxidation Event. The first slime appeared in the rock record between 1800 to 1600. By then, we didn't have as much greenhouse gases as we had in the Archean. So it couldn't have, I think, it could not have evolved, green slime would not have evolved prior to the complex cell, which evolved between 1800 and 1600 as well. So I don't think that argument holds, because we did not have methane as much as we did in the Archean, in the Middle Earth, yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Indrani. She and her team published one of the few papers I've ever read that dares to declare a paradigm shift in the understanding of evolution from 1800 to 800 million years ago. It's fascinating. You saw the reference up there. Check out the Boring Billion paper in Nature.